In our last episode on the First Crusade, we covered the successful siege of Nicaea, during which the collaboration of Latin and Byzantine armies, under the supervision of Alexios Komnenos, resulted in the first major victory for the Crusaders. The Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan lost his treasury, family and capital, but now he was getting ready to meet his enemy in the dangerous plains of Anatolia, leading to the Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097.
You might be thinking, why didn't they just chill out and avoid all this general misery? Well, it's not that easy even today, but at least now you can take better control of your mental state using our sponsor Endel. It's an app that provides personalized soundscapes to alter your mood, helping with anxiety, productivity, creativity, and getting to sleep. Their AI-powered program incorporates real-time information, such as your heart rate and the weather, to perfect its soundscapes, staying in tune with your circadian rhythms all day to improve the effect, and make you feel better both night and day. Neuroscientific studies found it was a fast and consistent way to access the desired state of mind. Use its 3 modes, relax, focus or sleep, to feel calm and safe, to enable lengthy concentration, or be soothed into a deep sleep. And afterwards wake up easy with its smart alarm feature that gradually wakes you up in a healthy fashion. Support our channel and get a special offer by being one of the first 100 people to use our link in the description. You will get a free week of audio experiences with Endel, so check it out now.
Despite the fact that the Crusaders showed their martial prowess and personal courage during the siege of Nicaea, in the end it was cunning Byzantine diplomacy that won the day. The sack of the ancient city was prevented, the prisoners from the People's Crusade liberated, but the Romans now had to ensure the cohesion of their Latin mercenaries and prevent them from slaughtering the Turkish garrison. The Seljuk defenders were secretly ferried off to Pelicanum, where they met up with the emperor, who gave out gifts to everyone, with additional rewards for those who wished to defect to his side. Alexios spent a fortune ensuring that the interests of the Crusaders aligned with his own, but he simultaneously was sending out a strong message to the Turks that the Byzantines had little to do with the savage Franks, and that anyone who willingly surrendered to him would not only be spared, but generously rewarded. As for the Crusaders themselves, their leaders were given gold, jewels, silk cloaks and horses, while wagons filled with bronze coins were distributed to the infantry and commoners. Despite that, tensions began to rise as the Latins became more suspicious of their generous host. Some were offended by the disparity in the rewards, while others were offended that rewards were given out in the first place, as this was supposed to be a religious movement motivated by faith, not possessions. And yet the biggest complaint came from the fact that only small groups were allowed in Nicaea to observe and pray in its churches. Before they could depart, Alexios seized his opportunity to address the only major leader who didn't swear an oath to him, Bohemond's nephew Tancred. The Norman once again refused and demanded for Alexios to accompany the Crusaders to their next target and to receive a royal tent identical to that of the emperor, proclaiming, "If you wish to dominate, then you must strive to serve." A brawl broke out, but eventually calmer minds prevailed, and Tancred swore the oath, kissed the emperor's hand, and received no gifts. Upon departure, he stared at Alexios and said, "I deem you worthy of being my enemy and not a friend." The council convened, and the Byzantines laid out a master plan to take over Anatolia. The next major target was naturally Antioch, but there were many smaller fortresses scattered throughout the harsh environment of the region that needed to be secured. Alexios put the imperial army and navy under the command of his brother-in-law John Ducas, who was tasked with the recovery of the coastal provinces. Seljuk Chaka Bey, who ruled from Smyrna semi-independently from the Sultanate of Rum, still posed a significant threat with his navy, and would prevent any supplies reaching the Crusaders once they made it to Antioch. And while some Latins must have felt abandoned by the emperor, it made no sense for him to join the already giant host, only adding to the logistical issues. Not to mention the risks of Cuman invasions, rebellious generals, or death of the emperor. What if the new ruler wasn't so cooperative with the Crusaders? Once again, The Franks were to be escorted by the trusted general Tatikios, who was extremely loyal to Alexios, and as a Turk himself, he knew exactly what the steppe riders were capable of. Before departing, Alexios gave them plenty of supplies, as well as precious insight, advising them to send envoys to the Fatimid Caliphate and make an alliance with common enemies. And so, 10 days after Nicaea was taken, June 26, 1097, the Crusaders formed a massive column and set off. One of the leaders, Stefan of Blois, wrote back home to his wife, "I say to you, sweetheart, that from Nicaea we will arrive at Jerusalem in 5 weeks, provided that Antioch does not slow us down." Little did he know, the Franks would venture in the mountainous lands in the midst of the summer heat to face an enemy that vanquished tens of thousands of Romans. To reduce the load on the logistics, the coalition army split in two, with the first force moving ahead with Tatikios and Bohemond. The two imperial agents at the front, accompanied by the contingents of Tancred, Robert of Flanders, and Robert of Normandy, while Godfrey, Baldwin, Stefan, Hugh, and Raymond were 3 days' march behind them. It is very difficult to determine the Crusader force, as there were many non-combatants, many among them women and children. The First Army had around 3,000 knights and 10,000 footmen, which included 2,000 Byzantine infantry, accompanied by at least as many camp followers. The second force was at least twice as large, totaling around 4,500 mounted warriors and 20,000 infantry, with just as many non-combatants. Riders were constantly galloping between the two halves, ensuring a steady flow of information about the route they were taking. And while the vast column crawled towards the crucial site of Dorylaeum, the Seljuks observed their every move from the hilltops. The Seljuk Turks were not alone, as Kilij Arslan managed to convince his rival, the Turkic Danishmends, to put their differences aside and combine their armies for a total force between 10 and 15,000 steppe riders. They were equipped with leather armor and piercing swords, but the greatest tool in their arsenal was the recurve bow, with an effective range of 50 to 60 meters. Combined with their expert riding ability and knowledge of the terrain, this was the deadly combination that crushed the Byzantines in Manzikert, back when Romanos also decided to split his army in two halves. It is important to note that unlike many other nomadic peoples, the Seljuk Turks of Anatolia were stripped of a massive advantage due to the nature of the terrain. Despite controlling the region for over a decade, they couldn't raise enough horses to provide each of their riders with half a dozen remounts, meaning that they had to sacrifice in either speed or endurance. In the afternoon of the 30th of June, a few Seljuk scouts were spotted, and the Crusader vanguard made camp and sent a messenger to the Second Army, informing them to be on high alert before continuing their march the next morning, imagining themselves as a Roman legion. Weapons taken up, trumpets sounding, arranged against the enemy in wings, centurions leading cohorts and centuries, standards raised, in an orderly fashion we began to set forth. After crossing a small river, the army entered the junction of two valleys, 45 kilometers from Dorylaeum. The open plain was wide enough for the Seljuk maneuvers, but also allowed them to catch the Crusaders by surprise. They couldn't have picked a better spot for an ambush. As soon as the Seljuk force was seen, Bohemond ordered a camp to be constructed by the infantry, picking a spot close to the river, hoping that the marshy ground would give them protection on one flank. In order to buy them some time, he and Robert of Normandy gathered the entire cavalry force of 3,000 knights and charged at Kilij Arslan. The fighting raged for almost an hour, but the light cavalry overwhelmed the Latin nobility, sending them back towards the makeshift camp, where some dug trenches, while the non-combatants and baggage train were directed towards the center. Hundreds of troops that were between the two Crusader armies poured into the battlefield, completely unaware of the ongoing battle, before they were captured or killed. Bohemond and Robert ordered their entire force to dismount and positioned the heavily armored cavalrymen to hold the vanguard and withstand volley after volley. There were no walls, just a mass of people in chain armor in the summer heat, holding together against these circling nomads who tried to pick them off one at a time, screaming and taunting in the hope they would turn their back and flee. One eyewitness reports, "They encircled us on all sides, engaging at close quarters and throwing darts and spears and firing arrows wondrously far and wide. They howled and shrieked and shouted, making a devilish noise in their high voices, crying and shouting like demons." One particular Frankish knight called Robert of Paris, with a notorious background, was one of the first casualties. Back at Constantinople, he mocked the emperor by sitting on his imperial seat. Instead of punishing him, Alexios invited him for a drink and explained they were allies, advising him to never chase their nomadic common enemy. Overcome by anger, the knight threw himself at the Seljuks after multiple civilians were shot around him. Within moments, his movement was slowed by arrows piercing his armor. Soon he was slashed by a blade in full sight of the rest of the knights, who continued to hold their shields up. Bohemond and Robert were now screaming, ordering their men to hold the line, fully aware that if the lines broke, there would be nowhere to run. At first, women constantly supplied the soldiers with buckets of water from the river, but as the hours dragged on, they also had the role of dragging the dead away from the front. Both duties were essential to the survival of everyone inside the camp, but with each passing moment, hope was fading. People and animals alike were crying out, while priests were praying for salvation, when suddenly Kilij Arslan gave the order to attack the camp from every direction, both on horse and on foot. Brutal hand-to-hand combat ensued, with many casualties, including Tancred's brother William. Charge after charge failed to break the Normans, but then suddenly a detachment appeared from the marsh and entered the camp, killing anyone in their path. A band of knights quickly rushed to close the gap and push them back, but the Christians were at the brink. It was then a group of cavalrymen appeared on the horizon. It had now been 5 hours since the first clash between the two armies, but after receiving word of the attack, Godfrey of Bouillon arrived at noon alongside 50 knights and bravely charged against the Seljuks, who halted their attack on the camp and turned on the reinforcements. Not long after, Raymond and Hugh joined the fight, and while Kilij Arslan still had the numerical advantage, the lack of remounts and length of the engagement meant that his army was extremely low on both energy and ammunition. At this point, Tatikios and Bohemond switched from a defensive stance to an offensive one, and as the Crusader cavalry engaged the steppe horsemen for the Battle of Anatolia, another detachment was seen on top of a hill behind the Seljuk line. Bishop Adhemar, who used local guides to outflank the enemy, gave a rousing speech as Provençal troops charged into the enemy camp, plundering the Sultan's tent, before setting it all on fire and advancing on the enemy. With enemies on all sides, the Turkic army had no space to execute their masterful maneuvers, and had no choice but to flee. The formations held, the reinforcements arrived, and this victory sent ripples through the entire Muslim world. Ibn al-Qalanisi, an Arabic writer, noted, "When news was received of the shameful calamity to the cause of Islam, the anxiety of the people became acute, and their fear and alarm increased." 3,000 nomads perished in the battle, while the Christians lost 4,000 of their own, who were celebrated as martyrs. The plunder of the camp resulted in numerous fine weapons, gold coins, jewels, horses and camels, not to mention much needed grain. Everyone involved played a crucial role, but the man who was celebrated the most was Bohemond of Taranto, who rallied his men to stand their ground and fight. It was his courage and leadership that prevented another massacre. It didn't take long before supernatural elements were infused into the events. Seljuk deserters swore that they had seen 2 horsemen with shimmering weapons and of wondrous appearance riding ahead of our army, menacing the enemy such that they allowed them no opportunity for fighting. Christian chroniclers later wrote that God sent 3 saints, George, Demetrius and Theodore, traditionally connected with the Orthodox Church, to save the Crusaders from doom. When the army broke camp on July 4th, they observed that the road was littered with dead horses and Seljuks, which they took as evidence of the saints charging after the routed enemy. The further the army moved away from Constantinople, the more biblical elements were infused into their beliefs and actions, the boundaries between both worlds slowly evaporating. News quickly reached Alexios, who immediately sent out his forces against Chaka. One army moved towards Abydos, while the main force marched up the Meander Valley. At the same time, the Byzantine navy sailed directly towards Smyrna, with Chaka's daughter on board as a gesture of good faith. Unbeknownst to the Byzantines, Chaka had recently fled his capital to meet up with Kilij Arslan, who personally executed him because of a growing mistrust, further destabilizing Western Anatolia. As in every other city, the Seljuks were a minority and couldn't hope to hold out, so they surrendered and a new governor was installed. As one of his first decisions, the new governor summoned a local nomad who was accused of a crime. Fearing for his own life, the desperate man grabbed a knife and stabbed the governor, which led to widespread violence as the sailors still stationed in the city massacred the local populace. Ducas had already moved on to his next target, the city of Ephesus, but when news arrived of what had just occurred at Smyrna, the Seljuks rode out and decided to meet the Romans in open battle. Both sides sustained heavy casualties, but eventually Ducas prevailed and took the city with no resistance. Leaderless, defeated, and surrounded by rebellious citizens, the Seljuks were fully aware of the severity of their situation, and city after city surrendered to Alexios. Sardis and Philadelphia quickly followed, but one particularly interesting case was that of Laodicea, where according to the Alexiad, Ducas accepted the surrender of the garrison and left it in the hands of the deserters. Based on this, we can conclude that he was short on men who could garrison the nearby fortresses, and that some nomads, including noble families, had adopted a sedentary lifestyle and chose to stay in their newfound homes and serve under Alexios. By the end of 1097, the emperor signed a truce with Kilij Arslan, having regained most of Anatolia, fulfilling the dream of his generation. But the campaign was far from over, and it didn't take long for the high morale of the Crusaders to evaporate as they made their way across the plateau. Tatikios led the crossing, which took place in mid-July, with temperatures reaching over 30 degrees Celsius. There were no major rivers, and to make matters worse, Kilij Arslan adopted a scorched earth policy, stripping the land of any supplies and burning down useful structures. A week into this tumultuous path, a stream was found, and thousands sprinted towards it. Many drank too much and suffocated, while others were trampled. The first major casualty of this expedition were the horses, a symbol of status and one of the greatest strengths of the Latin army. Western horses were larger than their eastern counterparts and demanded between 30 to 40 liters of water per day. Thousands of pack animals and hunting dogs also died, which meant that the pace at which the army could move was further slowed down. This was the sacrifice the army had to make, according to the Roman High Command, which decided to take the southern route instead of the usual one through Ankara, without even stopping at Amorium. The risky move tricked the Seljuks into thinking that the army was not heading towards Antioch, and would divert back to the coast at any moment. Coupled with their recent victory, this meant that the Crusaders were unopposed and didn't have to worry about ambushes and hit-and-run tactics. By August, the coalition made it to Antioch in Pisidia and resupplied, but by this point, thousands of soldiers perished, the horses, mules, hunting dogs and falcons were lost, and two of the major leaders were on the brink of death. Rimor was severely ill and didn't expect to recover, while Godfrey was badly mauled by a bear in a recent hunt. The next stop was Iconium, a formidable but abandoned fortress, in which the army was warmly welcomed by its Roman population. At Heraclea, there was finally a hint of resistance as the Turkic riders set an ambush, but after a short skirmish they fled the battle. The impact of Dorylaeum was so severe that nobody dared to stand against the knights for long. Instead of making for Cilicia, the army moved north towards Caesarea, then took a month crossing the Taurus Mountains, where the temperatures would drop severely, testing the constitution of the Franks, who were used to a very different climate. The roads were so steep that many knights decided to sell their weapons and armor. Whether this was a good plan or not, it solidifies the idea that even at this point, the shots were called by Alexios and his generals. As the troops advanced, Tatikios and his men rushed forward and liberated any strongholds, urging the citizens to ready their goods for the oncoming Crusaders and not to stir any trouble. In the absence of Seljuk authority, Roman and Armenian governors shifted their allegiance towards Constantinople, a step which was essential in case the siege of Antioch was prolonged and supplies were needed to support it. In November 1097, Anselm of Ribemont writes that the army held 200 fortresses and cities, while Stefan of Blois' account mentions 165. It is safe to assume that most of Anatolia was reconquered for the Komnenian dynasty. In our next video, the Crusaders will reach Antioch, where they would have external and internal enemies as tensions continued to rise, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.